Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted on July 2nd, 50 years ago today. It is a landmark piece of legislation that in the United States outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It ended unequal application of registration requirements for voting, racial segregation in schools, workplace, and also facilities that serve the general public. To talk about the significance of this day and the history of it are two guests in our studio. Dayvon Love. He is the founder of the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle out of Baltimore, Maryland. He's a champion debater and has considerable experience in grassroots activism in the Baltimore community. And also joining us is Bob Moore. He was the Maryland director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during the period just before the assassination of Martin Luther King. In 1964, he was one of the founding organizers of the community organization known as Union Jobs or Income Now, which was a project of Students for a Democratic Society. He was also an organizer for 1199 SEIU, United Healthcare Workers, for nearly 45 years. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Both of you.
Thank you.
Bob, let me start with you. This was, your period of civil rights activism. You were present as this act was being signed. Describe events leading up to the act and what happened immediately after.
I think the passage was always in doubt. It came up, I think, the Civil Rights Act because of all the demonstrations during the 60s over youth counters, drugstores, jobs, what have you, because America was a pretty discriminatory place. The city here was full of discrimination as when I was a kid. And in summer of 1963, of course, people know about the March on Washington for Jobs and Income Now. And as a result of that gathering, Kennedy suggested that he was going to put forth a Civil Rights Act. In fact, a demonstration that August was, in fact, meant to put a point on making sure that Kennedy and Congress passed. When Kennedy was assassinated, I think that's November '63, there was great concern that all would be lost. We didn't know that the president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, who had been Kennedy's vice president, had just become president, and whether or not, since he was from Texas, a southern state, with a big history of racism and discrimination, whether this was the end of the Civil Rights Act. But Johnson moved forward and then 64 passed it. But by that time, I think most of us and young folks in the movement had moved on to trying to organize real political power and give poor people and black people a organization to organizational grounding so that jobs and income and clean, decent neighborhoods to live in would also become a reality.
Was Baltimore then a segregated city until that time?
Pretty much. I guess it's just coming out. I forget the year they passed in the public accommodations bill, but certainly I began my activism as a student demonstrator on freedom rides when CORE and others came to town. I wasn't allowed to get arrested in those days, and then in '63 at the Gwynn Oak Amusement Park, which was the first time I got arrested, we were trying to put an end to discrimination at that facility. And so, yes, it was a pretty segregated town.
And 50 years later, Dayvon Love, you're active in trying to fight some, not segregated amusement parks, but other kinds of segregation. how do you sort of deal with the Civil Rights Act now?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Many things that Mr. Moore said, I think, helps put context to the way that I think the Civil Rights Act of '64 affects people's collective consciousness around issues of racial justice. Because what often happens is that people, they pluck the Civil Rights Act of '64 out of its historical context. So, people talk about the ending of discrimination as being like the end game for what civil rights was about, instead of the importance of organizing communities to have the power to be able to determine the economic, political, and social dynamics in their communities. And oftentimes, conceptually, it's difficult for people to understand civil rights beyond just the notion of ending segregation, because of the way that the Civil Rights Act and the March on Washington, et cetera, is lifted up as kind of, the culmination of what civil rights is supposed to be about. And so I know in my work, one of the things that we have to do on top of the advocacy that we do on particular issues is to frame the context around racial justice beyond just the notion of colorblindness, beyond the notion of just not discriminating, but also investing in communities to be able to build the power necessary for the kinds of things like guaranteed income, which was a part of, Dr. King's call on the I Have a Dream speech in August of 1963. And even if you look at then the other civil rights acts, the Voting Rights Act of '65, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which were all supposed to try to help to create investment in the very communities that were affected. And one thing I'd like to note, one of the things that Dr. King remarked about in an essay he wrote called Testament of Hope, where he says that 9 out of the 10 provisions in the Civil Rights Acts were not being enforced. And one of the things that really was disheartening to him was to see that, a lot of the money that was supposed to be put aside to supplement the Civil Rights Act of '64 was being directed towards the war in Vietnam. And this for him, was devastating, because for him, in order for the Civil Rights Act of '64 to be meaningful and substantive, it needed to be accompanied with many of the things that Mr. Moore talked about in terms of economic justice, and that being taken off the table, I think undermines what it was supposed to do. And I think that's why we're in the situation we're in today.
Yes, so it needed to be enforced fully in order to have its intended impact.
Absolutely.
Bob, one thing that was very significant in what both of you said in your introductory statements is the economic justice part of it. And something you were struggling as the act was being signed, something you were struggling for was the economic justice of African Americans. And I see Dayvon saying he's still working on that issue. So let's talk about the lineage from then to now in terms of economic justice issues. Well,
like I said, in the summer 1964, I think it's also important to remember that there was a thing called Freedom Summer and a thing in August called the Democratic Party Convention, where after a summer of intense organizing in Mississippi, a Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party came to the Democratic Party Convention because they pledging to be loyal Democrats, where they were not allowed to hold position or office in the Mississippi Democratic Party. And Lyndon Johnson also at that point, this is just a couple of months after the signing of the Civil Rights Act, told liberals and progressives to get the Mississippi people in line, and they offered a compromise of 2 seats, 2 voting seats, as opposed to a full accreditation in the party. And people saw that as also a betrayal, while on the one hand there's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We know by that, we believe, or many of us believe, that the only way to get real economic justice was also to have a real democracy where people were included in the process. And here was Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act and making sure that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party went away, right? Which will be, I'm sure some people will recognize that anniversary. Whether we'll get the same glow that the 1964 Civil Rights Act get, I don't know. But remember, the Voting Rights Act came the following year, 1965, after Bloody Sunday and demonstrations in Alabama. And, you know, we still have pretty much well, in Mississippi we have the highest, I think the highest portion of blacks in the in elected office in Mississippi, right, and the highest percentage of black population, and it's still a pretty poor place, and there are no, I don't think there are any statewide holders in Mississippi who are African Americans.
What kind of jobs were African Americans engaged in at the time, and what were the kinds of things you were fighting for?
Well, our project started in Baltimore as a attempt to organize the unemployed. It's hard for people to remember this, but during that period of time, it was an attempt. There was progressives attempted to get what they call a full employment economy, and so there was this legislation going on. It was what they call, I think, the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Bill, and so we thought a good way to get started was trying to organize all the people unemployed and press for training and jobs. It's also, in Baltimore at the time, they had just, in 1964, they unfolded what they call sort of a war on poverty. This is a forerunner of the national program, where I actually had my first political interaction with the city council and then a councilman, Don Schaefer, because we saw the program as that they had developed as being not creating any jobs or economic. It was supposed to teach people how to do the good jobs, and it seemed to be more welfare than any projects. Could you build schools? Could you build houses? The kinds of things that they had been done during the after the Great Depression. Can you do those things in a city? Down. It's about then that also steel jobs began to slow down in the mid-'60s, and so people come from, migrants who had come from the South, like my people, who found jobs, decent, good jobs in industry, union jobs, by the way, and now this next generation, my generation, if you didn't have high school, if you didn't have a college diploma or a high school diploma, it was hard to get an industrial job. And so I think during this period in the mid-'60s, people did apply a lot of welfare and programs, but nothing that actually would change people's economic conditions.
Dayvon, what did you learn in terms of your schooling, your education? What did you learn about this history? And is it resonating with you in terms of what you've learned and what Bob is describing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. We were talking before just about how, there's a pretty considerable youth advocacy community in Baltimore. A lot of young people that are interested in social transformation and pushing for racial and social justice, but a lot of us aren't really connected to a lot of the people here in Baltimore who were doing the work and were on the front line. And it really, for me, hasn't been until recently that I'm getting acclimated with some of the history of Baltimore, civil rights movement. When Mr. Moore mentioned the Gwynn Oak Park desegregation event, it was interesting. You mentioned that Delegate Jill Carter, who's been instrumental in a lot of the work that we've been doing here in Baltimore. Her father, Walter Carter, was really instrumental in that effort. She tells me stories about, the work that her father did on that issue and on other issues as well. So for me, it's just really important, to hear more of that history, because we don't really learn that in school. We don't learn about, the Perrin Mitchells, the Marion Bascoms, the Vernon Dobsons, the Homer Favors, the people who are responsible for really pushing forward some of the progress that we see here in Baltimore. So I think that's definitely something that needs to be highlighted more.
And schools in Baltimore with a 63% African American population, Why isn't the curriculum more tuned to what happened to African Americans and their history?
Well, it's a very complex question. I mean, I think the simplest way to put it is that, you know, I think there were many people that benefited from the gains of the civil rights movement. But I think what you'll find is that there are a lot of folks who benefited from that didn't carry on the legacy. You know, I think there were some people who were so enthralled in integration, the ethos of integration in the sense of, you know, going into white communities and affluent communities, you know, leaving behind a lot of the folks who were responsible for grooming them and, you know, putting them in a place where they could take advantage of those opportunities without having, you know, a commitment to giving back to those from which they came. And I think what you see in Baltimore is exactly that. Folks who, you know, don't revere that legacy the way they should, particularly being legatees of that very struggle that created the opportunities we have today. And so, you know, I mean, that's kind of a controversial thing to say, but I'm not sure there's any other explanation as to why, you know, Baltimore being so prominent during the civil rights movement. I mean, Baltimore was one of the first cities when Brown versus Board of Education came down to be integrated, was forced to be integrated, you know, one of 4 cities that was a part of that effort. And Baltimore was really in the center of that. And again, those are things I didn't learn about till, you know, I was an adult. And again, it just speaks to the lack of reverence that's given in the political mainstream in Baltimore to the importance of that legacy.
Bob, you were saying earlier that at the time you were conflicted. You know, do you continue the civil rights struggle, fight for economic justice for your people, or, you know, actually go to school and learn some more about you know, about the world, about the situation you find yourself in? You felt conflicted. Why did you end up doing what you did?
I suppose at the time, to me, it clearly, well, these were moral questions and moral issues for me, as they were for many other people, especially Black Americans. But we had a conflict because our families wanted us, you know, like, get that education, go on, you'll get a job, things will change by and by. And at the time, there were many of us who thought, you know, you have to stand up for injustice as it is. And for a while, the conflict kept me coming and going until about 1965, when I finally just dropped out, right, and then tried to get my bearings. It is, you know, I think generation. It's also, you can see it in the media. You know, the stories that get reported and passed on are what the stories. Because I look at what's happening today, and you know, certain things from whether it was the Iraq War, it's kind of you know, history prior to a given period is just ignored, and so here we are, right? And we're also at a point where the old Dixiecrats are now conservative Republicans trying to roll back people's right to vote. And so while there's lots of progress, and certainly Obama being in the White House is some kind of, and that's progress, because it's not, I couldn't have imagined that you know, 50 years ago that would happen. But it's happened, and that's a victory. But at the same time, the issues, the economy comes in on where African Americans are still, you know, first to be fired, last to be hired, as we used to say back then, and there's complete resistance to doing anything to ameliorate that situation. People don't want to spend money on education, you know, because we never did really get to the, you know, the basis of the ruling, which was that 1954 ruling that education had to be, you know, equality based so that everybody got an equal education. And part of that, you know, was the resistance to the notion that schools should be integrated at a time when the cities are changing, the jobs are leaving, the industrial jobs are gone, people are fleeing the city to greener pastures, and you wind up being left with poor people who can't do a whole lot. The open housing campaign that led to the election of Spiro Agnew as governor of Maryland, right, is a strange story, but none of that has gone away, right? There's still these issues out here that are not being addressed. Progress, yes, and I look that there's going to be a brighter day because, and it's so good to hear Dayvon, because I often wonder, I've been kind of lost to whatever youth are doing, but I'm very pleased that young people are struggling, and I kind of understand that it's going to be different than what it was. Right.
Bob, you're far too young to pass the baton to Dayvon so soon. You have to be an active part of this struggle for civil rights that is still going on today. Because while the schools may not be segregated, this city still is, in terms of some sections of the city getting more, and those are usually the white communities in the greater Baltimore area, perhaps. And the city still remains to be quite segregated, and your struggles that you are fighting for here, whether it's economics, jobs, or school curriculum, or housing, this is a very segregated city. How do you explain that, and how do you deal with it as an activist?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the lessons that the civil rights movement gives is that there are ways beyond just overt racism that economic devastation is done to black folks. And so when you think of segregation, you're thinking about a series of policies that have the effect of reinforcing, racial inequality. So for instance, when you look at redlining, where, federally backed banks wouldn't, invest in giving mortgages to black folks that lived in certain neighborhoods, and that kind of practice continues today. It's not called redlining, but in terms of what it is that city government invests in, the city just invested in a tax increment financing bill that gave a developer, Michael Beatty, over $100 million to do development at Harbor Point, and one of the questions that people ask is, well, why not invest in the very people and communities that are most directly affected by things like institutional racism to build up communities' power, because that would be mutually beneficial to everyone in the city doing it that way. But what you find is that the investment that's done happens along racial lines in the city in terms of development in the harbor, development in places like Kent and Harbor East. Whereas in places like Lower Park Heights, Winchester, Sandtown, parts of Edmondson Village, you don't find the same level of investment, and you can't possibly look at that investment, of public dollars without seeing that it's clearly a racialized way in which those resources are invested, which exacerbates the racial inequality. But what happens is that because there isn't a sign that says, whites only, people don't think that means that there is racism present. And so a part of the work that we have to do is to illuminate the fact that during the civil rights movement, you had similar issues in terms of, redlining and restrictive covenants, things of that nature that, didn't necessarily have to explicitly say whites only, but had the effect of creating the wealth. Look at the Homestead Acts, where billions of dollars were given, primarily to white families, which pretty much built the white middle class that we see in our society today that black people were excluded from. I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think is important to illuminate that history during the civil rights movement so that people see the corollaries between that and current policies, which investment is done in a racialized way that exacerbates the discrimination, the segregation, and the racial inequality.
So one of the solutions to all of this is really jobs, and jobs.
Correct.
It was an issue back then. It is an issue now. Through economic emancipation, a lot of the issues that we're struggling about could really be resolved, because money is power. Having ability to act differently, if you were well resourced, you would probably act differently. So what do you say to those who are fighting for economic justice issues today?
I don't know what there is to say except pick up the pace. It was so disappointing. There was a big effort to get raise the minimum wage here, and when I saw where it wound up, $10.10 in when is it, 2018 or whenever it is,
People
right?
are fighting for $15 right. minimum wage in some parts of the country, but even that is really very little to bring a family right. of 4,
right.
Up in the city.
Right, and my union is engaged now in a fight with Hopkins over trying to raise wages substantially to get people to $15 an hour, which to get there you won't it won't bring you peace of mind, right? So and it won't necessarily allow you to raise your kids in a much different economic style. So so it still goes on today, and while people can pat themselves on the back, and and I take credit for some victories along the way. I became a union organizer because I thought that would be a vehicle to which at least black working people would empower them to help change economic conditions. But even in labor, it is struggling to stay alive, and so.
Obama is at this moment, fighting for the 1010, or that's been signed and as executive order signed into being enacted in 2017. 1010 is insufficient to raise a family. $15 an hour is insufficient to raise a family. Today there's a huge demonstration going on in South Africa where the Metal Workers Union is fighting for a 12% increase on their $2.25 an hour wage. The struggle for a living wage in this country and around the world is such a big issue in a country that is so rich. 50 years later, we are fighting for the same thing. What do you think will be transformative, Dayvon? What do you think will actually make this country and those elites in power, make a difference in terms of people's wages?
I mean, I think really one of the conversations that's recently been reignited is the conversation around reparations. And I think, when you think about the 246 years of free labor that pretty much was the startup capital, the economic inertia that made America the global superpower it is, and the 100 years of Jim Crow where black folks were excluded from economic competition that's necessary to engage in asset wealth building activity. I think reparations is one of the few things, if you look at it just from a policy standpoint, what it would take to at least begin the radical redistribution of political power and wealth that Dr. King once talked about. He once gave a speech where he talked about a lot of the subsidies that white farmers had gotten, land grant colleges had gotten in order to start their institutions so that they could be self-sustaining. And reparations to me seems like one really central and important remedy to provide the capital necessary for black folks to be able to build the kinds of institutions where we would be able to protect our own quality of life, to be able to build our institutions and have the kind of economic parity that would encourage the kind of social and racial justice that I think was the spirit of the civil rights movement.
Some people would argue, Bob, that reparations is not the answer for the economic injustice against African Americans in this country. What do you say to that?
I would ask them, what do they think the answer is? But the question of any community, right, is what is its economy based upon, right? And are people able to participate in that economy. And clearly, right, there are millions of Americans, not just color of skin, but just happen to be poor or immigrants who are just trying to get a foot up. You have to do something, otherwise what we have is a very, the rich get richer, and meanwhile people are crumbling, and all around the world. And it's why, in part, I think it has to be some kind of new labor movement, right? One that is structured to look at the bigger picture than just to have a simple, what they call pure and simple unionism, where you got a contract and you got employees in this job or that skilled job, and you get a contract, and that's all. Because the reason where the unions are taking a beating today is because they don't, most people don't, even though they might be working and need just as much as, don't see that as a vehicle for change. Plus the laws make it, workers don't really have civil rights, right, in the country. You work for somebody, like we just seen in the Supreme Court. They don't think you should have pills. You won't get pills, and that's what workers find themselves. And if they happen to be public workers, nobody likes paying taxes. But on the other hand, we subsidize an awful lot of employers and people who are supposed to create jobs and economic development, and it doesn't happen. I think the answer is we have to have a more democratic society where the voice of the poor and blacks and Latinos and women get to take on some of this power, because it is very uneven. It's clearly uneven. The Congress doesn't serve. I mean, they may be serving what they perceive to be the interests of their husband. You tell me how in Alabama, as bad off as people are, poor people, black people are in Alabama, how they could be on the wrong side of so much progressive legislation, worrying about balancing a budget on the backs of the poor. So,
gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the Real News Network for a discussion on civil rights and wrongs. And this is obviously an ongoing discussion that we will have to keep addressing. So perhaps we'd like to have you back, and we'll have the discussion on reparations and union organizing, and continue on the Real News Network.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.